Imagine a secret war, a tiny island nation, and a superpower brought to its knees by a colossal blunder. This isn't a movie script. It's the incredible true story of the Bay of Pigs invasion, one of the most infamous failures in modern history. How did the mighty United States, with its powerful CIA, fail so spectacularly in its attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba? Let's rewind the clock to 1961 and uncover the series of miscalculations, deceptions, and sheer bad luck that led to this disaster. The story really begins in 1959, when Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries successfully overthrew the US-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Initially, Washington wasn't entirely hostile, but as Castro began nationalizing American-owned businesses and strengthening ties with the Soviet Union, alarm bells started ringing in the Eisenhower administration. The Cold War was at its peak, and the idea of a communist stronghold just 90 miles off the coast of Florida was simply unacceptable. So, the CIA got to work. In March 1960, President Eisenhower authorized a covert operation. The plan was codenamed a Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime. It had multiple parts, including propaganda and economic warfare, but the centerpiece was the creation of a paramilitary force. The idea was to recruit, train, and equip a group of Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's rule. This force, named Brigade 2506, would be the spearhead of the invasion. The CIA set up secret training camps in Guatemala, believing these exiles, filled with patriotic fervor, would be the perfect catalyst for a popular uprising against Castro. The thinking was simple. Once the brigade landed, the Cuban people, supposedly groaning under Castro's tyranny, would rise up and join the fight. The invasion would look like a purely Cuban affair, allowing the US to maintain plausible deniability. It was a neat theory, but it was built on a foundation of wishful thinking. By the time John F. Kennedy inherited the presidency in January 1961, the plan was already in motion. Kennedy was young, new to the job, and facing immense pressure to appear tough on communism. His advisors, including top figures from the CIA and the military, presented the invasion plan as a viable, well-thought-out operation. They assured him of its high chance of success. Despite his own private doubts and a desire to reduce the scale of US involvement, Kennedy felt trapped. Canceling the operation could be seen as a sign of weakness and might lead to political backlash from the well-organized Cuban exile community. Reluctantly, he gave the green light, but with one crucial change. Kennedy was adamant about minimizing the overt appearance of US involvement. He drastically scaled back the planned air support. The original plan called for multiple powerful airstrikes to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground, ensuring the invaders would have control of the skies. Kennedy, however, worried that large-scale bombing would make it impossible to deny American participation. He authorized only a limited preliminary strike 2 days before the main landing. So, on April 15, 1961, 8 B-26 bombers, painted to look like Cuban military planes and flown by exile pilots, took off from Nicaragua. Their mission was to cripple Castro's air force. But the strike was a partial failure. They only managed to destroy about half of Castro's planes. Crucially, the world immediately saw through the disguise. News photos of the planes revealed them to be US models, and the defecting Cuban pilot story fell apart within hours. The element of surprise and plausible deniability were gone before the first invader even hit the beach. Faced with this international exposure, Kennedy made another fateful decision. He canceled the second, and more important, wave of airstrikes that was scheduled for the morning of the invasion itself. This single decision would have catastrophic consequences for the men of Brigade 2506. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 17th, the invasion began. The force of about 1,400 exiles landed at a remote, swampy area on Cuba's southern coast, known as the Bahía de Cochinos, or the Bay of Pigs. The location was chosen by the CIA because it was isolated, and had a nearby airfield they hoped to capture and use. But it was a terrible choice. The bay was surrounded by treacherous coral reefs that damaged some of the landing craft, and the swampy terrain was difficult to move through. Worse still, Castro knew they were coming. US security had been shockingly lax. Cuban intelligence had agents among the exiles in Miami, and the preparations were something of an open secret. As soon as the brigade landed, they were met not by cheering crowds of liberated Cubans, but by Castro's waiting military forces. Castro himself took personal command of the counterattack. The men of Brigade 2506 fought bravely, but the odds were impossible. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They desperately needed air support to fight off Castro's troops and, most importantly, his remaining air force. But because of Kennedy's order, that support never came. Castro's surviving planes, including a few T-33 jets, strafed the invaders on the beaches and, critically, sank 2 of the supply ships, the Houston and the Rio S. These ships carried the bulk of the brigade's ammunition, food, and communication equipment. Without resupply, their situation became hopeless. For 2 days, the brigade fought on, pinned down on the beaches. They radioed desperate pleas for help, for the promised air cover, but their calls went unanswered. From the U.S. Navy ships offshore, sailors could only watch the tragedy unfold, under strict orders not to intervene. Kennedy, realizing the operation was a lost cause and still desperate to hide America's hand, refused to authorize a direct U.S. military rescue. By April 19th, it was all over. The invaders, out of ammunition and completely surrounded, were forced to surrender. The invasion had lasted less than 72 hours. Over 100 members of the brigade were killed in action, and nearly 1,200 were captured. The dream of liberating Cuba had turned into a nightmare. The aftermath was a political and diplomatic disaster for the Kennedy administration. The failed invasion was a profound public humiliation for the United States. It made the new president look weak and incompetent on the world stage. It also handed Fidel Castro an enormous propaganda victory. He had stood up to the mighty Yankee imperialists and won. His position within Cuba was strengthened immeasurably, and he pushed the country even closer into the embrace of the Soviet Union. In the long run, the Bay of Pigs had even more dangerous consequences. It convinced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that Kennedy was indecisive and could be pushed around. This miscalculation would contribute directly to Khrushchev's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba the following year, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis the moment the world came closest to nuclear war. For the captured members of Brigade 2506, their ordeal continued. They spent 20 months in Cuban prisons. Finally, in December 1962, a deal was struck. The U.S. government agreed to send $53 million worth of food and medicine to Cuba in exchange for the prisoners' release. The Bay of Pigs is a powerful case study in failure. It was a failure of intelligence, which wrongly assumed the Cuban people would revolt. It was a failure of planning, choosing a poor landing site and underestimating Castro's forces. And it was a failure of leadership, marked by indecision and a fatal desire for plausible deniability that doomed the mission from the start. It serves as a stark reminder of the tragic consequences that can result when covert operations are based on flawed assumptions and wishful thinking. Thank you so much for watching. The Bay of Pigs is a complex event with so many layers, and I hope this gave you a clear overview of what happened. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Kennedy right to cancel the air support? See you next time.